Welcome everyone, and thank you for being here today. I'm excited to introduce our presentation on inheritance, specifically focusing on the case involving siblings and the paternal grandfather. On this first slide, we see the title, Inheritance of Siblings with the Paternal Grandfather, along with the copyright 2025 by Continuous Learning Development. Today, we'll explore different scenarios, starting with the case where there are no other heirs by virtue of a prescribed share. We'll look at how the paternal grandfather's inheritance is affected in such situations, especially when the mucosama, where the grandfather is considered among the siblings, entitles him to more than 1/3 of the estate. We'll cover 5 different forms of this situation and clarify the details so you can better understand the complexities involved. So, let's get started and delve into these inheritance cases together. Let's take a closer look at how the estate is divided in different scenarios involving the paternal grandfather. In the first case, when the deceased has a paternal grandfather and one sister, the grandfather receives 2/3 of the estate. In the second scenario, with a paternal grandfather and one brother, the grandfather's share is reduced to half of the estate. Moving on, if there are 2 sisters along with the paternal grandfather, he gets half of the estate. When there are 3 sisters, the grandfather's share decreases further to 2/5. Finally, if the paternal grandfather is accompanied by one brother and one sister, he also receives 2/5 of the estate. These examples highlight how the presence of different relatives impacts the inheritance shares, which is a key concept in understanding estate distribution. By recognizing these patterns, we can better grasp the principles of inheritance law and how they apply in various family situations. Let's discuss the situation when the paternal grandfather is entitled to 1/3 of the estate, regardless of whether this is through mucosama or not. This scenario involves 3 specific cases. The first is when the deceased's paternal grandfather is present along with 2 brothers. The second involves the grandfather, 1 brother, and 2 sisters. And the third case includes the grandfather and 4 sisters. Now, an important point to understand is that when the 1/3 share of the estate, which the grandfather is entitled to, exceeds the actual share he would receive through mucosama, the rule differs. In such cases, the grandfather is entitled to the full 1/3 as a prescribed share of the estate. This typically happens when the siblings' combined share is more than double what the grandfather would otherwise receive. So, the key takeaway here is that the prescribed 1/3 is guaranteed for the grandfather when the siblings' shares are substantial enough to surpass his mucosama share. Understanding these nuances helps us see how estate shares are allocated fairly, especially in complex family scenarios. It's a crucial part of our broader discussion on inheritance distribution and ensuring justice in these matters. Now, moving on to the second case, where there are other legal heirs entitled to specific shares besides the deceased's paternal grandfather and siblings. In this scenario, we focus on the paternal grandfather, and there are 7 specific cases that apply to him. The key point here is that the paternal grandfather's share is determined through something called mucosama, which is a method of calculating his entitlement. Essentially, if the grandfather's share through mucosama exceeds 1/3 of what remains after the prescribed shares are distributed, then he is entitled to that larger share. Additionally, he is also entitled to at least 1/6 of the entire estate. This means that his share could be either the amount calculated through mucosama or the 1/6, depending on which is greater. This concept is important because it helps ensure that the grandfather's rights are protected and fairly calculated, especially in complex inheritance situations where multiple heirs are involved. Connecting this to the overall theme, it highlights how Islamic inheritance laws carefully balance the rights of various heirs, ensuring fairness through specific calculations like mucosama. Let's take a closer look at this example. Here, we're seeing how the estate is divided among certain family members. The husband receives half of the entire estate, which is quite straightforward. Now, the remaining half is then split between the paternal grandfather and the brother. What's important to notice is that the grandfather gets half of that remaining half. Since half of the estate was allocated to the husband, the other half is shared. The grandfather's share, which is half of that remaining half, amounts to a quarter of the whole estate. And this quarter is more than 1/6, but less than 1/3 of the entire estate, which shows how these fractions compare. It also highlights that the grandfather's share is more than 1/3 of what's left after the husband's part is taken, emphasizing the proportional distribution. This example helps us understand the logic behind estate sharing, how each person's share is calculated, and how fractions relate to the whole. It connects to our overall theme of understanding inheritance laws and ensuring fair distribution based on these principles. Let's take a closer look at this example. Here, we see how the estate is divided among different heirs. The key point to understand is how the paternal grandfather's share is determined after the initial shares are allocated. In this case, the paternal grandfather is entitled to 1/3 of the remaining estate. But this only applies if that 1/3 exceeds the share he would receive through other prescribed shares, like the mucosama, and if it's also more than 1/6 of the total estate. So what does this mean in practice? Essentially, after giving out the fixed shares to certain heirs, the grandfather can claim a significant share of what's left, but only if that share surpasses his minimum prescribed entitlement. This example helps us see how the rules of inheritance can be quite nuanced, balancing prescribed shares with the actual distribution of the remaining estate. It's a good illustration of how Islamic inheritance law ensures fairness and clarity among heirs. Let's break down this example to understand the distribution of the estate. So in this case, the remainder is 9, which represents the amount to be divided among the heirs. The wife receives a quarter of this amount, which is 12. Now, focusing on the key points, the number 9 is divided between the grandfather and the brothers. The grandfather gets 1/3 of 9, which equals 3. The remaining 2/3, which is 6, are shared by the brothers. What's interesting here is how the siblings' shares compare to the grandfather's. The brothers each receive 2, so collectively they get 4, which is less than the grandfather's 3. But when we look at the overall estate, the brothers' share is more than what each sibling would normally get. Specifically, each brother would get 2, totaling 4, which is more than the grandfather's 3. However, it's also important to note that this amount is still less than 1/6 of the entire estate, emphasizing the proportionality and fairness in inheritance distribution. This example really highlights how calculations and proportions work in inheritance scenarios, especially when multiple heirs are involved. It's all about understanding the ratios and ensuring each heir gets their fair share according to the specified rules. Let's take a closer look at this example. We see that the table lists the shares of different heirs. The husband has half, the mother and paternal grandfather each have 1/6, and the brother has 1. Now, what's interesting here is the specific condition for the paternal grandfather's inheritance. The key point is that the paternal grandfather is to receive 1/6 of the estate, but only if this share exceeds what he would get through the mucosama, or the method of equal distribution, and also if it's more than 1/3 of what's left after other shares are allocated. This condition ensures fairness and adherence to specific Islamic inheritance principles. The example illustrates how these shares are calculated, especially when multiple conditions are involved. Understanding these nuances helps us grasp how inheritance shares are determined in complex scenarios, emphasizing the importance of both the proportionate shares and the conditions that might modify them. It connects to the overall theme of ensuring just and equitable distribution according to Islamic law. Let's take a closer look at this example to understand the distribution of the estate. Here, we have a wife, a paternal grandfather, and 2 brothers. The key point is how the paternal grandfather's share is calculated through the mucosama method. In this scenario, the grandfather's share equals 1/3 of the remaining estate after the wife receives her share. Importantly, this share is also more than 1/6 of the entire estate. To clarify, after the wife takes her 1/4, the remaining estate is 9 parts. The grandfather's share, which is 1/3 of that remaining 9, amounts to 3. This same amount also matches his share when divided through mucosama. Additionally, this share exceeds the 1/6 of the total estate, which is 2 parts. So, the key takeaway here is understanding how the grandfather's share, calculated through mucosama, aligns with the 1/3 of the remaining estate and surpasses the 1/6 of the whole estate. This example helps us see the practical application of these distribution principles within Islamic inheritance laws, reinforcing how shares are calculated based on different methods and their relation to the total estate. Let's take a closer look at this example. Here, we see that the paternal grandfather's share through the mucosama is equal to 1/6 of the estate. Now, what does this mean? Essentially, it reflects how the estate is divided among the heirs according to Islamic inheritance rules. In this particular case, we have 2 daughters, a paternal grandfather, and a brother. The key point to understand is that the division occurs because of the concept of farqur, which arises when a certain share cannot be divided evenly among the heirs. So, in this example, the number of heads, which is 2 daughters, is multiplied by the basis of distribution, which is 6, representing the total parts into which the estate is divided. The daughters, therefore, receive 2/3 of the estate, or 2 parts out of 6. Meanwhile, the grandfather and the brother each receive 1 part of the 6, which is their respective shares. This calculation illustrates how the distribution works when certain heirs, like the daughters, are entitled to a larger share, while others, such as the grandfather and brother, receive smaller, fixed portions. This example highlights the importance of understanding how shares are calculated based on the number of heirs and the basis of distribution, ensuring that everyone receives their rightful portion according to Islamic inheritance law. Let's take a closer look at this example to understand how the shares are distributed. Here, we see that the daughters collectively receive half of the estate, which is represented as a half. The paternal grandfather, on the other hand, gets 1/6, or. Now, an interesting point here is the relationship between the prescribed shares. The example states that the grandfather's 1/6 of the estate is equal to 1/3 of what remains after these shares are allocated. This means that once we've given out the daughter's share and the grandfather's share, the remaining estate, when divided into 3 parts, makes up exactly the grandfather's 1/6. This setup illustrates a common principle in inheritance calculations. The prescribed shares are often interconnected, and understanding these relationships helps us determine the correct distribution. The key takeaway is that, in these scenarios, the shares are not independent. They're linked in a way that the portion allocated to one party affects the remaining estate available for others. By working through examples like this, we can better grasp how Islamic inheritance shares are calculated and how they ensure a fair and proportional distribution according to specific rules. This understanding is vital in applying these principles accurately in real-life cases, which is the overall goal of this presentation. Let's take a closer look at this example to understand how shares are distributed through the mucosama. Here, we see that the husband's share is a half, and the paternal grandfather's share is. There are also 2 brothers, each with a share of 2. When we calculate the husband's share through the mucosama, it turns out to be equal to 1/6 of the entire estate. Additionally, this same share also equals 1/3 of what remains after we've distributed the prescribed shares to other heirs. What this illustrates is how the distribution process works in stages, ensuring that each heir gets their rightful portion. The key point here is understanding that the husband's share, through mucosama, is not just a fixed amount, but also relates proportionally to the remaining estate after other shares are allocated. This example helps clarify the overall concept of how shares are calculated and distributed, which is essential for ensuring fairness and accuracy in inheritance distribution. Now, let's look at the rules regarding the distribution of the remaining estate after the prescribed shares have been allocated. If the remaining estate is more than 1/6 of the total, then the paternal grandfather receives the largest share among the 3 options. However, if the remainder exactly equals 1/6, then that amount goes directly to the paternal grandfather as a prescribed share. and if the remainder is less than 1/6, or if there's nothing left to distribute, then the case falls under the all rule, and in that scenario, the paternal grandfather still gets 1/6 of the estate. These rules are crucial because they help us determine the grandfather's share depending on how much estate remains after the initial shares are distributed. It shows a clear hierarchy and specific conditions that guide the distribution process, tying back into our broader discussion of inheritance laws and their applications.